History loves to dress itself in mystery. We grow up with stories of fearless warriors, strange plagues, doomed crusades, and cruel punishments that sound too bizarre to be true. But here's the twist: many of these myths weren't myths at all. Before we pull back the curtain, do me a favor, hit that like button if you enjoy uncovering the darker, stranger side of the past. And if you haven't already, subscribe not for the algorithm, but because you'll want to keep coming back for journeys like this. Drop a comment, too. What's the weirdest historical myth you've ever heard? Tonight, we're pulling back the curtain on the medieval world, where legends weren't just stories, they were lived realities. And once you hear what really happened, you'll never look at history the same way again. So dim the lights, get comfortable, and let's begin our journey through the strangest medieval tales that turned out to be shockingly true. The Berserkers were Vikings actually. A battlefield in the 9th century. Viking warriors crash into their enemies, but among them are men who don't fight like anyone else. They howl like animals, bite into their shields, ignore wounds that would cripple most men, and charge with terrifying, unnatural fury. These were the Berserkers. For centuries, historians assumed they were nothing more than Norse exaggerations, colorful additions to sagas filled with dragons and magic swords. Surely no man could turn into an unstoppable beast, right? Well, not so fast. Archaeological finds reveal something strange. Warrior graves lined with wolf and bear pelts, hinting at ritual transformation. Then comes the wildest clue: mushrooms. Specifically, Amanita muscaria, that iconic red and white spotted fungus from fairy tales. This mushroom is psychoactive, and it grows naturally in Scandinavia. Imagine mixing those mushrooms with fasting, chanting, and pre-battle rituals. The result? Hallucinations, convulsions, surges of adrenaline, exactly what berserkers were described as experiencing. Enemies wrote of madmen immune to pain, shield biters foaming at the mouth, charging like human storms. This wasn't poetry. It was chemical warfare, medieval style. The word berserk still survives today, but back then it meant one thing: chaos in its most terrifying form. And just when you think it can't get any stranger, the next myth takes chaos to a whole new level. Imagine walking through the streets of Strasbourg, France, on a hot summer day in 1518. Suddenly, you see a woman step into the road and start dancing. No music, no festival, no celebration, just pure, unstoppable movement. At first, it looks odd. But then more people join her. Dozens, then hundreds, all dancing until their feet bled, until exhaustion dropped them dead in the street. This wasn't a joke. It wasn't a carnival. It was a real, documented event, the dancing plague. City leaders, in one of the most baffling decisions in history, decided the best cure was to encourage it. They built a stage, hired musicians, and told the dancers to get it out of their system. The result? Even more deaths. What caused it? Historians suggest two possibilities. Ergot poisoning, a hallucinogenic fungus that grows on rye bread, known to cause convulsions and madness. Mass psychogenic illness, in other words, collective hysteria brought on by famine, disease, and crushing despair. Whatever the cause, it turned Strasbourg into a deadly medieval nightclub. It's one of the most chilling reminders that sometimes the line between mind and body can blur in terrifying ways. And speaking of blurred lines, our next story is about faith, innocence, and one of the most disastrous journeys in medieval history. In 1212, word began to spread of a boy, just a shepherd, who claimed he had received a divine vision. His mission? To lead an army, not of warriors, but of children, straight to the Holy Land, not with swords, but with faith. Thousands followed him. Children, teenagers, and desperate peasants, marching barefoot across Europe, convinced that God himself would part the seas for them. Parents wept, priests hesitated, but the children kept walking, singing hymns, starving on the roads, collapsing in villages. For years, historians dismissed the story as exaggerated legend. But church records, royal decrees, and city archives confirmed something very real happened. The march was no fairy tale, and its ending was brutal. Some were turned back at the Alps. Many perished along the way. Worse still, some were tricked by greedy merchants, packed onto ships, and sold into slavery in North Africa. The so-called Children's Crusade became one of the darkest parables of the Middle Ages. Faith was not enough to shield them from the cruelty of the world. But as tragic as that sounds, it's far from the strangest medieval myth we now know was real, because in the next story, even animals weren't safe from the courtroom. Imagine a village in France, 1386. A pig escapes its pen, bites a child, and instead of being slaughtered, it's dragged to court. Yes, a real courtroom with a judge, lawyers, and witnesses all to decide the fate of a pig. Sounds like satire, right? Wrong. In medieval Europe, animals were actually put on trial. Pigs, cows, goats, even insects. They were assigned defense attorneys, imprisoned, sometimes even excommunicated by the church. One infamous case involved a sow found guilty of killing a child. She was dressed in human clothing, paraded through town, and then publicly hanged. And it wasn't an isolated event. Rats, locusts, and even weevils were dragged into legal disputes. One group of villagers even sued a swarm of bugs for eating their crops, and yes, the court actually appointed a lawyer for the insects. To us, it's absurd. But to medieval minds, justice applied to all creation. If animals were part of God's world, then they could also be judged under his law. It's a reminder that the Middle Ages were not only brutal, but also wildly imaginative, and sometimes imagination was far stranger than reason. And speaking of imagination, let's talk about one of the most infamous torture devices that never actually existed. Few images of medieval cruelty are more famous than the Iron Maiden, that towering metal coffin lined with spikes designed to pierce victims slowly while they suffocated. It shows up in museums, horror movies, and textbooks as a symbol of medieval barbarity. But here's the shocking truth: it's a complete fraud. The Iron Maiden was never used in the Middle Ages. In fact, the first Iron Maiden was cobbled together in the late 1700s, likely as a museum attraction to horrify tourists. The Victorians adored it, turning it into a theatrical symbol of medieval savagery. Now, make no mistake, the real Middle Ages had no shortage of torture devices. The rack, the heretic's fork, thumbscrews, and something disturbingly called the pear of anguish were all very real. But the Iron Maiden? Pure invention. So why did the myth stick? Because it fit the image people already had of the Dark Ages. Brutal, superstitious, inhuman. The Iron Maiden became a perfect, if false, mascot for everything we think the medieval world was. But sometimes the myths about medieval ignorance come from us, not from them. Case in point, the idea that everyone thought the earth was flat. One of the biggest cliches about the Middle Ages is that everyone believed the earth was flat, as if medieval sailors thought they'd sail off the edge of the world like falling off a giant pancake. But the truth, they knew the earth was round. In fact, educated Europeans had known it since the time of the ancient Greeks. Medieval scholars like Thomas Aquinas and Isidore of Seville wrote about it. Even monks teaching schoolboys explained the earth's spherical shape, and there was proof everywhere. Ships disappeared bottom first over the horizon. Lunar eclipses cast curved shadows. Travelers in different latitudes saw different constellations. To medieval thinkers, it was obvious. So where did the flat earth myth come from? Ironically, it wasn't from the Middle Ages at all. It was invented in the 19th century. Writers wanted to paint the Renaissance and Enlightenment as a heroic escape from medieval ignorance. And to do that, they needed to make the Middle Ages look dumber than they really were. The idea stuck because it's a neat story. But the real Middle Ages were many things: violent, superstitious, often cruel, but flat earthers they were not. And if you think their view of the cosmos was strange, just wait until you hear how they decided guilt in court. By boiling water and burning iron. Forget fingerprints, witnesses, or DNA. In medieval Europe, guilt was decided by something far stranger: trial by ordeal. If you were accused of theft or blasphemy, the court might order you to plunge your arm into boiling water to retrieve a stone. If your wounds healed cleanly after a few days, you were innocent. If not, you were guilty. Other ordeals included carrying red-hot iron bars for several paces or being thrown into a river tied up. If you sank, you were innocent but dead. If you floated, you were guilty because pure water rejected you. To us, it looks like barbaric nonsense. But oddly enough, it sometimes worked not because of miracles, but psychology. Many guilty people confessed before risking it, while priests occasionally rigged the ordeals by cooling the water or judging burns leniently. Still, by 1215, the church finally banned trials by ordeal, realizing that boiling people to prove innocence wasn't the best look for divine justice. But if you think that's extreme, let's shift to one of the most famous medieval legends: a man in green tights with a bow. Today, Robin Hood is the dashing hero of storybooks, robbing the rich, giving to the poor, outwitting greedy sheriffs. But the real origins of the legend are far darker. Medieval records from the 13th and 14th centuries mention men with suspiciously familiar names: Robhad, Hobahad, Robin Hood, often listed as criminals or fugitives. These weren't noblemen fighting injustice. Most were peasants accused of theft, poaching, or resisting corrupt officials. The earliest ballads about Robin Hood don't portray him as a charming rogue. He's brutal, quick-tempered, and disturbingly fond of murdering monks. Maid Marian didn't even appear until much later. Over time, the legend softened. By the Tudor era, Robin Hood had transformed into a cheerful rebel with suspiciously modern ideas about wealth redistribution. The green-clad freedom fighter we know today is more Renaissance propaganda than medieval reality. So, was Robin Hood real? Probably not as one man, but a mix of real outlaws blended into a myth. A medieval fanfiction stitched together by centuries of storytellers. And speaking of misunderstood figures, let's talk about the Black Knight, who wasn't the villain people think. When you hear Black Knight, you probably imagine a brooding warrior in dark armor, lurking in shadows, swearing vengeance under a blood-red moon. basically medieval Batman. But in reality, the Black Knight wasn't an evil sorcerer or cursed warrior. It was just a nickname. Knights who wore black armor or carried a black coat of arms were often called Black Knights. One of the most famous was Edward of Woodstock, better known as the Black Prince. A respected English commander in the 14th century, he earned the name either for his armor or for the devastation he left behind in France. But he was no villainous outlaw, he was royalty. The idea of the Black Knight as a sinister loner came much later in romantic literature and 19th century novels. By the time Hollywood got hold of it, the Black Knight had fully transformed into a stock villain, mysterious, vengeful, and always wearing too much eyeliner. But in the real Middle Ages, the Black Knight was just a branding choice. Less cursed villain, more color-coordinated warrior. And if you thought that was strange, wait until you hear about monks who built a holy city in the middle of a swamp. Some medieval stories sound like drunken exaggerations. One of them claimed monks built a massive abbey in the middle of a swamp, complete with bridges and walkways rising out of the marsh like a holy Venice. For centuries, scholars dismissed this as folklore. After all, who would build a monastery surrounded by mosquitoes the size of pigeons? But archaeology proved them wrong. Crowland Abbey, founded in the 8th century and expanded throughout the Middle Ages, was very real. Excavations revealed wooden platforms set on deep piles, clever drainage systems, and even a triangular stone bridge that still stands today. Why build in a swamp? 2 reasons: isolation from worldly temptations and cheap land no one else wanted. The monks turned the marsh into a hub of prayer, farming, and even eel trading. It turns out that medieval monks weren't just holy men. They were also brilliant engineers, capable of transforming bogs into centers of faith and economy. And while their swamp building was ingenious, the next legend is one the church has always wished would stay buried. For centuries, whispers spread about a woman who disguised herself as a man, rose through the church hierarchy, and was elected pope until she gave birth in the middle of a papal procession. Her name? Pope Joan. Officially, the church insists she never existed. Historians for centuries brushed her off as scandalous gossip. But there are strange gaps in the records. An 11th century chronicle lists an unnamed pope in just the right place where Joan supposedly reigned. Some even point to the bizarre tradition of enthroning popes on a special chair with a hole in the seat, allegedly to confirm their male qualifications. Was she real? The evidence is murky. Some historians argue she was a composite of real events. Others say she was erased from official history. Either way, the persistence of her story tells us something important. Medieval society was fascinated and terrified by the idea of women wielding power. Whether Joan was fact or fiction, her legend survived because it captured both fear and fantasy. And speaking of fear, let's talk about one date that still haunts people today: Friday the 13th. The superstition around Friday the 13th didn't come from spilled salt or broken mirrors. It came from a very real historical event, the dramatic downfall of the Knights Templar. On Friday, October 13th, 1307, King Philip IV of France launched a mass arrest of the Templars. He accused them of bizarre crimes, spitting on the cross, worshipping a mysterious head, but in reality, he was drowning in debt to them. The Templars were rich, powerful, and inconvenient. Hundreds were tortured and imprisoned. In 1314, The last Grand Master, Jacques de Molay, was burned alive. According to legend, he cursed both the king and the pope as he died, and both were dead within a year. That day, Friday the 13th, became infamous. While the superstition only spread widely centuries later, its roots lie in this brutal purge of one of the most powerful orders of the medieval world. It's proof that sometimes even our modern fears are built on medieval blood and fire. But as dark as that sounds, the next story is about something surprisingly bright: medieval surgery that actually worked. When most people picture medieval medicine, they imagine dirty barbers hacking off limbs, chanting prayers, and hoping the patient survived. And yes, that happened. But here's the twist: some medieval doctors were surprisingly skilled. Archaeological evidence shows trepanation, drilling holes in skulls, was performed with enough precision that many patients survived. Surgeons stitched wounds, set broken bones, and even performed cataract surgery using sharp needles to push clouded lenses out of the way. Brutal? Yes. But effective? Sometimes shockingly so. Their medical manuals recommended honey for wounds, wine as disinfectant, and linen bandages, all practices that actually worked. Not quite penicillin, but far better than the rub mud on it stereotype we imagine. Of course, not everything was brilliant. Astrology, urine analysis, and leeches were all part of the toolkit. But to say medieval medicine was only superstition isn't fair. In fact, some of their practices were centuries ahead of their time. And if medicine wasn't as bad as we think, here's another myth ready to be scrubbed clean. We've all heard the stereotype: medieval peasants reeking of sweat, never bathing, walking around like human onions. But archaeology says otherwise. Bathing was common. Soaps made from animal fat and ash were used widely. Nobles perfumed their gloves and used herbal tooth powders. Cities had public bathhouses, sometimes too popular, leading church leaders to complain that they were a little too social. Monks were required to shave and bathe regularly. Women plucked armpit hair with terrifying dedication. Even peasants soaked in wooden tubs when they could. So where did the dirty medieval myth come from? Mostly from later Renaissance and Enlightenment writers who wanted to paint the Middle Ages as a dark, ignorant time. Add in some 19th century art full of filthy peasants, and the image stuck. Sure, if you were a field laborer working 14 hours in manure, you didn't smell like roses. But to claim everyone was filthy, that's pure historical slander. And if you think cleanliness was weird, wait until you hear about the medieval trial that literally involved eating bread to prove innocence. Among the strangest judicial rituals of the Middle Ages was the ordeal of the morsel. Here's how it worked. If you were accused, especially as a clergyman, you'd be handed a piece of holy bread. You had to eat it in front of witnesses. If you swallowed it calmly, God had spared you innocent. But if you choked, gagged, or looked nervous, guilty, case closed. The logic was that God would not allow a liar to swallow the body of Christ. In reality, it was basically a medieval lie detector powered by dry bread and fear. The practice eventually fell out of favor, probably because even innocent men choke sometimes. But for a while, it was considered a valid test of divine judgment. Medieval justice once again proved that imagination often mattered more than evidence. And speaking of rituals, the next story takes us deep into the secret initiation of the Knights Templar. The Knights Templar are shrouded in mystery warrior monks sworn to poverty, chastity, and obedience. But what really happened when a new knight joined their ranks? The initiation began in silence, often at dawn. A candidate, usually a noble knight, entered the chapel, stripped of weapons and wealth. There, before the master and his brothers, he was questioned. Did he join freely? Was he married? Did he owe debts? The Templars demanded total commitment, no divided loyalties. Next came the vows: poverty, chastity, obedience. These weren't symbolic. A wealthy knight might give up lands and servants, then live in straw bedding and eat plain rations. Marriage and family were forbidden. Obedience meant absolute submission. If ordered into certain death, he was expected to obey. The vows were sealed by kissing holy relics, a fragment of the true cross, bones of saints. Outsiders later twisted this into rumors of blasphemous kisses and secret rites. In truth, it was a sacred covenant binding the knight to God. Finally, the initiate received the white mantle with the red cross, the ultimate symbol of purity and sacrifice. To betray, it was to invite damnation. From that moment, he belonged not to himself, but to the temple. It was a ritual of humility, obedience, and terrifying devotion, part of why the Templars became both feared and legendary. But while knights bound themselves to vows of poverty, another corner of history reveals a world of wealth, pleasure, and desire. Let's travel to Pompeii. Among the ruins of Pompeii lies a building unlike any other, the Lupanar, the city's most notorious brothel. To the Romans, prostitution wasn't hidden in shadows. It was open business, as practical as bread or wine. The Lupanar was the centerpiece, its very name derived from lupa, meaning she-wolf, a slang word for prostitute. Clients didn't have to ask where it was. Carved phallic symbols in the streets literally pointed the way. Inside, the air was thick with oil lamps, wine, and whispered bargains. The brothel had 2 floors. The ground level contained cramped stone cubicles with straw mattresses, cheap, efficient, and uncomfortable. Upstairs, wealthier patrons enjoyed slightly larger rooms, wooden beds, and more privacy. But the most shocking part wasn't the architecture, it was the walls. Above each room in the Lupanar, vivid frescoes depicted different sexual acts, painted in explicit detail. To modern visitors, they're shocking. But to Pompeians, they were practical. Many clients were travelers, foreigners, or illiterate. The frescoes acted as a menu. Point to the image you wanted, and you'd be directed to the right room. These weren't coy symbols or veiled hints. They were blunt, transactional illustrations, like advertisements painted in bold colors. Graffiti carved by clients still covers the walls. Some boastful, "I had a good time with Fortunata." Others crude reviews, praising or mocking the women by name. Even the prostitutes themselves left inscriptions, tiny traces of humor and defiance in lives otherwise erased by history. What survives today is extraordinary. Not just stone rooms, but voices. Pompeii's brothel reveals a Roman world where desire was public, normalized, and painted on the walls for all to see. And yet, behind the frescoes lay the women themselves, slaves, foreigners, survivors. Their reality was far harsher than the walls suggest. Behind the frescoes and graffiti were the women themselves, the true heart of Pompeii's brothel. And their lives were harsh. Most were slaves, bought or captured from far-off provinces Gaul, Greece, Syria, North Africa. Their foreign origins were often marketed as exotic attractions. They were stripped of their identities and given simple Romanized names like Fortunata, Lucky One, or prima, the first. Names that reduced them to roles, not people. Their work was relentless. From morning to night, they serviced multiple clients in tiny, airless rooms for as little as a single coin, the price of a loaf of bread. The money rarely stayed with them. It went straight to the brothel's owner, who profited while the women endured. Legally, they carried the status of infame social outcasts stripped of rights. They couldn't marry respectable men, inherit property, or testify in court. They were essential to Roman society, yet permanently shamed by it. Still, their humanity shines through in the graffiti they left behind, witty remarks, names scratched into the walls, and even prideful boasts of skill. They were not faceless commodities. They had voices, frustrations, and resilience. If the women were marginalized, the clients were the opposite men of every class, from soldiers to merchants to elites. A visit could cost as little as one as, cheap enough that even a laborer could afford it. For wealthier men, the upstairs rooms offered privacy and softer beds. But whether rich or poor, the act was the same: quick, transactional, stripped of romance. What's shocking is that Roman men faced no stigma for visiting brothels. Married men went openly, without shame. Fidelity was expected only of wives, not husbands. To the Romans, prostitution was not immoral, it was practical, even necessary. Graffiti reveals how casual it all was. Clients left names, crude jokes, even customer reviews. Some proudly declared their favorites. Others mocked the women. The walls of the Lupanar became a living record of Pompeii's sexual economy. The graffiti of the Lupanar is one of the most fascinating archives of daily life in antiquity. One inscription reads, "I had a good time here with Fortunata for 1 coin." Another bluntly boasts, "I've screwed many girls here." Some are downright humorous. A man wrote, "Girls, weep, for my manhood has left you and now chases men." Not all came from clients. Women left their marks too. One scratched her name beside a heart. Another carved a playful boast about her skill. These tiny carvings are voices echoing across 2 millennia, snippets of pride, humor, and survival etched into stone. The Lupanar wasn't hidden, it was central to Pompeii's economy. 10 rooms, constant traffic, and cheap prices meant steady income. Multiply that by weeks and years, and the brothel became a financial engine. Nearby taverns sold wine to loosen clients' purses. Vendors hawked food to men stumbling out. Even the frescoes acted as permanent advertising. It was commerce in its rawest form. Yet here lies the contradiction. The women were despised even as their labor was essential. Roman society tolerated prostitution, taxed it, and even regulated it. But prostitutes themselves remained dishonored forever. The Lupanar embodied that paradox, a place both central and marginal, tolerated and shamed, where human desire collided with economic reality. And when Mount Vesuvius erupted in 79 CE, burying Pompeii under ash, it froze this paradox in time. The Lupanar remains one of the most haunting reminders of how Romans lived, desired, and exploited. But now, let's return to the medieval world, where marriage wasn't about romance, but duty to the state. And nowhere was that truer than in Sparta. If you think medieval marriage was unromantic, wait until you see Sparta. In most of Greece, marriage meant family alliances, property, and maybe even a little affection. But in Sparta, it was about one thing: producing strong children for the state. Spartan weddings were strange. A bride's head would be shaved, she'd be dressed in men's clothing, and then hidden away in a dark room. The groom, often much older, would secretly visit her at night. Their encounters were brief, hidden, and strictly functional. Why so secretive? Spartans wanted their men focused on military life, not family. Husbands often lived in barracks, spending most of their time with fellow soldiers. Wives managed households and farms, wielding more independence than women in most of Greece, but romance wasn't part of the equation. Children born from these unions weren't just family heirs, they were future warriors and mothers of warriors. If a baby looked weak, it was left to die. Harsh, but to the Spartans, the survival of the state mattered more than the survival of any individual. It's a brutal reminder that not every culture built marriage around love. For Sparta, it was about duty, discipline, and the endless demand for strength. By now, it should be clear, many of the strangest sounding stories from history weren't fantasies at all. Berserkers probably did fight in drug-fueled rages. Entire towns danced themselves to death. Children really marched on crusade. Animals stood trial. Other tales, like the Iron Maiden or the Flat Earth belief, turned out to be myths about myths fabrications we created centuries later to make the Middle Ages look more ignorant or cruel than they actually were. The reality? The medieval world was already bizarre enough. It didn't need embellishment. And that brings us to the final part, our conclusion. So, what do we make of all this? The Middle Ages and the ancient world weren't just full of superstition, they were stranger, more complex, and sometimes more real than the myths we've been telling. Vikings didn't just rage in stories, they may have gone into battle high on mushrooms. People in Strasbourg really danced themselves to death. Children marched across Europe, believing faith alone could conquer kingdoms. Animals stood trial. Torture devices were faked. And no medieval scholars didn't think the earth was flat. Even in Pompeii, desire was advertised openly, carved into stone, and painted above brothel doors. Each story shows us something vital. History is never as simple as we imagine. Sometimes legends turn out to be real. Other times, what we thought was fact is nothing but invention. The truth is, the past was messy, wild, and profoundly human. People laughed, feared, loved, fought, and made mistakes, just like us. Only their world looked a little stranger through the lens of time. So the next time someone tells you a medieval myth, don't dismiss it too quickly. Because as we've seen, the line between legend and history is thinner than we think. And that's just the beginning. There are countless more myths and mysteries waiting to be uncovered. Which of these stories shocked you the most? Was it the Berserkers, the dancing plague, or the trials where pigs got lawyers? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to hear which myth blew your mind. If you enjoyed this journey, make sure to subscribe for more deep dives into the strangest corners of history. Because remember, sometimes the truth really is stranger than the legend.